Books. Books, I say. The books are full of words. They sure are. Hello, everybody. Good morning. Hi. I'm here. I'm awake-ish. I'm ready to read books and get educated and filled with enlightenment of the wonderful world of literature. It's gonna happen today. Well, as we proceed to read the second part of Terry Pratchett's The Color of Magic. The chapter titled Descending of 8. We're about a third of the way through the book. I'm not sure how far we'll get through today. My voice is better than last time because I didn't spend the entire week voice acting in the funkiest voices you can imagine. Especially the one for Escape Academy that we did. So hopefully it goes smoothly. The yawns, they start early though, which is... yeah, I expected as much. So the last time, what happened was... what happened last time? We recounted the tale of the grand city of Ankh-Morpork exploding into fire due to a bar fight related to people being really greedy and wanting vast riches belonging to tourists to themselves. Yes. And the wizard Rincewind, who was acting as that guy's escort, who thinks he still has to, you know, help that guy survive. Otherwise, there's gonna be bad things happening to him, you know. But that's not right, because now everybody wants to kill that guy. So, we'll see where this goes. They've escaped out of the exploding city, and they set off for lands unknown. Yes. Anyway, that's my terrible recount of what happened last time. Because honestly, I'm bad at recounting things. Really bad. I'm real bad at it. Real bad at it. Lurk. Okay, Pixie. Thank you for the lurk. Hi, hello. Alright, so let me just turn on the good music, the reading music, instead of this schlock. My reading music. There you go. Descending of 8. Prologue. The Discworld offers sights far more impressive than those found in universes built by creators with less imagination but more mechanical aptitude. Although the disk's sun is but an orbiting moonlet, its prominence is hardly bigger than croquet hoops. This slight drawback must be set against the tremendous sight of Great Atoin the Turtle, upon whose ancient and meteor-riddled shell the disk ultimately rests. Sometimes in his slow journey across the shores of infinity, he moves his country-sized head to snap at a passing comet. But perhaps the most impressive sight of all, if only because most brains, when faced with the sheer galactic enormity of Atuin, refuse to believe it, is the endless rimfall, where the seas of the disk boil ceaselessly over the edge into space. Or perhaps it is the rimbow, the 8-colored world-girdling rainbow that hovers in the mist-laden air over the fall. The 8th color is octarine, caused by the scatter effect of strong sunlight on an intense magical field. Or perhaps again, the most magnificent sight is the hub. There, a spire of green ice, 10 miles high, rises through the clouds and supports at its peak the realm of Dunmanifestin, the abode of the Disc Gods. The Disc Gods themselves, despite the splendor of the world below them, are seldom satisfied. It is embarrassing to know that one is a god of a world that only exists because every improbability curve must have its far end. Especially when one can peer into other dimensions at worlds whose creators had more mechanical aptitude than imagination. No wonder, then, that the Disc Gods spent more time in bickering than in omnicognizance. On this particular day, blind Io, by dint of constant vigilance, the chief of the gods, sat with his chin on his hand and looked at the gaming board on the red marble table in front of him. Blind Io had got his name because, where his eye sockets should have been, there were nothing but 2 areas of blank skin. His eyes, of which he had an impressively large number, led a semi-independent life of their own. Several were currently hovering above the table. The gaming board was carefully carved map of the Discworld, overprinted with squares. A number of beautifully modeled playing pieces were now occupying some of the squares. A human onlooker would, for example, have recognized in 2 of them the likenesses of Bravd and the Weasel. Others represented yet more heroes and champions, of which the disc had more than an adequate supply. Still in the game were Io, Offler, the crocodile god Zephyrus, the god of slight breezes, Fate, and the lady. There was an air of concentration around the board now that the lesser players had been removed from the game. Chance had been an early casualty, running her hero into a full house of armed gnolls, the result of a lucky throw by Offler. And shortly afterward, Knight had cashed his chips, pleading an appointment with Destiny. Several minor deities had drifted up and were kibitzing over the shoulders of the players. Side bets were made that the lady would be the next to leave the board. Her last champion of any standing was now in a pinch of potash in the ruins of still smoking Antmore pork, and there were hardly any pieces that she could promote to first rank. Blind Io took the dice box, which was a skull whose various orifices had been stoppered with rubies, and with several of his eyes on the lady, he rolled 3 5s. She smiled. This was the nature of the lady's eyes. They were bright green, lacking iris or pupil, and they glowed from within. The room was silent as she scrabbled in her box of pieces, and from the very bottom produced a couple that she set down on the board with 2 decisive clicks. The rest of the players, as one god, craned forward to peer at them. "A renegade whippered and from forth of clerk," said Arthur the crocodile god, hindered as usual by his tusks. "Well, wee. With one claw he pushed a pile of bone-white tokens into the center of the table. The lady nodded slightly. She picked up the dice cup and held it as steady as a rock. Yet all the gods could hear the 3 cubes rattling about inside, and then she sent them bouncing across the table. A 6, a 3, a 5. Something was happening to the 5, however. Battered by the chance collision of several billion molecules, the die flipped onto a point, spun gently, and came down a 7. Blind Io picked up the cube and counted the sides. "Come on," he said wearily. "Play fair." The road from Ankh-Morpork to Chirrum is high, wide, and winding. A 30-league stretch of potholes and half-buried rocks that spirals around mountains and dips into cool green valleys of citrus trees, crosses liana-webbed gorges on creaking rope bridges, and is generally more picturesque than useful. Picturesque! That was a new word to Rincewind, the wizard, Bachelor of Magic from Unseen University, failed. It was one of a number he had picked up since leaving the charred ruins of Ankh-Morpork. Quaint was another one. Picturesque meant he decided after careful observation of the scenery that inspired Chuflower to use the word that the landscape was horribly precipitous. Quaint, when used to describe the occasional village through which they passed, meant fever-ridden and tumble down. Chuflower was a tourist, the first ever seen on the Discworld. Tourist, Rincewind had decided, meant idiot. As they rode leisurely through the thyme-scented, bee-humming air, Rincewind pondered on the experiences of the last few days. While the little foreigner was obviously insane, he was also generous and considerably less lethal than half the people the wizard had mixed with in the city. Rincewind rather liked him. Disliking him would be like kicking a puppy. Currently, Chuflower was showing a great interest in the theory and practice of magic. It all seems, well, rather useless to me, he said. I always thought that, a wizard just said the magic words and that was that. Not all this tedious memorizing. Rincewind agreed moodily. He tried to explain that magic had indeed once been wild and lawless, but had been tamed back in the mists of time by the olden ones, who had bound it to obey, among other things, the law of conservation of reality. This demanded that the effort needed to achieve a goal should be the same regardless of the means used. In practical terms, this meant that, say, creating the illusion of a glass of wine was relatively easy, since it involved merely the subtle shifting of light patterns. On the other hand, lifting a genuine wine glass a few feet in the air by sheer mental energy required several hours of systematic preparation if the wizard wished to prevent the simpler principle of leverage flicking his brain out through his ears. He went on to add that some of the ancient magic could still be found in its raw state, recognizable to the initiated by the eightfold shape it made in the crystalline structure of space-time. There was the metal octiron, for example, and the glass octogen. Both radiated dangerous amounts of raw enchantment. It's all very depressing, he finished. Depressing? Rincewind turned in his saddle and glanced at Chuflower's luggage, which was currently ambling along on its little legs, occasionally snapping its lid at butterflies. He sighed. Rincewind thinks he ought to be able to harness the lightning, said the picture imp, who was observing the passing scene from the tiny doorway of the box slung around Chuflower's neck. He had spent the morning painting picturesque views and quaint scenes for his master, and had been allowed to knock off for a smoke. When I said harness, I didn't mean harness, snapped Rincewind. I meant, well, I just meant that, I don't know, I just can't think of the right words. I just think the world ought to be more sort of organized. That's just fantasy, said Chuflower. I know, that's the trouble, Rincewind sighed again. It was all very well going on about pure logic and how the universe was ruled by logic and the harmony of numbers, but the plain fact of the matter was that the disk was manifestly traversing space on the back of a giant turtle, and the gods had a habit of going around to atheist houses and smashing their windows. There was a faint sound, hardly louder than the noise of the bees in the rosemary by the road. It had a curiously bony quality, as of rolling skulls or a whirling dice box. Rincewind peered around. There was no one nearby. For some reason that worried him. Then came a slight breeze. That grew and went into the space of a few heartbeats. It left the world unchanged save in a few interesting particulars. There was now, for example, a 5-meter tall mountain troll standing in the road. It was exceptionally angry. This was partly because trolls generally are, in any case, but it was exacerbated by the fact that the sudden and instantaneous teleportation from its lair in the Ramarok Mountains 3,000 miles away and 1,000 yards closer to the rim had raised its internal temperature to a dangerous level in accordance with the laws of conservation of energy. So it bared its fangs and charged. "What a strange creature," Two-Flower remarked. "Is it dangerous?" "Only to people," shouted Rincewind. He drew his sword and with a smooth overarm throw completely failed to hit the troll. The blade plunged on into the heather at the side of the track. There was the faintest of sounds, like the rattle of old teeth. The sword struck a boulder concealed in the heather, concealed, a watcher might have considered, so artfully that a moment before it had not appeared to be there at all. It sprang up like a leaping salmon, and in mid-ricochet plunged deeply into the back of the troll's grey neck. The creature grunted, and with one swipe of a claw gouged a wound in the flank of Two-Flower's horse, which screamed and bolted into the trees at the roadside. The troll spun around and made a grab for Rincewind. Then its sluggish nervous system brought it the message that it was dead. It looked surprised for a moment, and then toppled over and shattered into gravel. Trolls being silicaceous life forms, their bodies reverted instantaneously to stone at the moment of death. "Arr!" thought Rincewind, as his horse reared in terror. He hung on desperately as it staggered two-legged across the road, and then, screaming, turned and galloped into the woods. The sounds of hoofbeats died away, leaving the air to the hum of bees and the occasional rustle of butterfly wings. There was another sound, too, a strange noise for the bright time of noonday. It sounded like dice. Rincewind? The long aisles of trees threw Two-Flower's voice from side to side and eventually tossed it back to him, unheeded. He sat down on a rock and tried to think. Firstly, he was lost. That was vexing, but it did not worry him unduly. The forest looked quite interesting, and probably held elves or gnomes, perhaps both. In fact, on a couple of occasions he had thought he had seen strange green faces peering down at him from the branches. Two-Flower had always wanted to meet an elf. In fact, what he really wanted to meet was a dragon, but an elf would do, or a real goblin. His luggage was missing, and that was annoying. It was also starting to rain. He squirmed uncomfortably on the damp stone and tried to look on the bright side. For example, during its mad dash, his plunging horse had burst through some bushes and disturbed a she-bear with her cubs, but had gone on before the bear could react. Then it had suddenly been galloping over the sleeping bodies of a large wolf pack, and again its mad speed had been such that the furious yelping had been left far behind. Nevertheless, the day was wearing on, and perhaps it would be a good idea, Two-Flower thought, not to hang about in the open. Perhaps there was He racked his brains trying to remember what sort of accommodation forests traditionally offered. Perhaps there was a gingerbread house or something. The stone really was uncomfortable. Two-Flower looked down and, for the first time, noticed the strange carving. It looked like a spider. Or was it a squid? Moss and lichens rather blurred the precise details, but they didn't blur the runes carved below it. Two-Flower could read them clearly, and they said, "Traveler, the hospitable temple of Bel-Shamharoth lies 2,000 paces hubward." 1,000 even. Now this was strange, Two-Flower realized, because although he could read the message, the actual letters were completely unknown to him. Somehow the message was arriving in his brain without the tedious necessity of passing through his eyes. He stood up and untied his now biddable horse from a sapling. He wasn't sure which way the hub lay, but there seemed to be an old track of sorts leading away between the trees. This Bel-Shamharoth seemed prepared to go out of his way to help stranded travelers. In any case, it was that or the wolves. Two-Flower nodded decisively. It is interesting to note that several hours later, a couple of wolves who were following Two Flower's scent arrived in the glade. Their green eyes fell on the strange eight-legged carving, which may indeed have been a spider or an octopus, or may yet again have been something altogether more strange, and they immediately decided that they weren't so hungry at that. About 3 miles away, a failed wizard was hanging by his hands from a high branch in a beech tree. This was the end result of 5 minutes of crowded activity. First, an enraged she-bear had barged through the undergrowth and taken the throat of his horse with one swipe of her paw. Then, as Rincewind had fled the carnage, he had run into a glade in which a number of irate wolves were milling about. His instructors at Unseen University, who had despaired of Rincewind's inability to master levitation, would have been amazed at the speed with which he reached and climbed the nearest tree, without apparently touching it. Now there was just the matter of the snake. It was large and green, and wound itself along the branch with reptilian patience. Rincewind wondered if it was poisonous, then chided himself for asking such a silly question. Of course it would be poisonous. "What are you grinning for?" he asked the figure on the next branch. "I can't help it," said Death. "Now would you be so kind as to let go? I can't hang around all day." Give me a short break. I need to let Mira inside. Okay. "I can," said Rincewind defiantly. The wolves clustered around the base of the tree, looked up with interest at their next meal, talking to himself. "It won't hurt," said Death. If words had weight, a single sentence from Death would have anchored a ship. Rincewind's arms screamed their agony at him. He scowled at the vulture-like, slightly transparent figure. "Won't hurt," he said. "Being torn apart by wolves won't hurt." He noticed another branch crossing his dangerously narrowing one a few feet away. If he could just reach it. He swung himself forward, one hand outstretched. The branch, already bending, did not break. It simply made a wet little sound and twisted. Rincewind found that he was now hanging onto the end of a tongue of bark and fiber, lengthening as it peeled away from the tree. He looked down, and with a sort of fatal satisfaction realized that he would land right on the biggest wolf. Now he was moving slowly as the bark peeled back in a longer and longer strip. The snake watched him thoughtfully, but the growing length of the bark held. Rincewind began to congratulate himself, until, looking up, he saw what he had hitherto not noticed. There was the largest hornet's nest he had ever seen, hanging right in his path. He shut his eyes tightly. "Why the troll?" he asked himself. "Everything else is just my usual luck, but why the troll? What the hell is going on?" Click. It may have been a twig snapping, except that the sound appeared to be inside of Rincewind's head. Click, click, and a breeze that failed to set a single leaf a-tremble. The hornet's nest was ripped from the branch as the strip passed by. It shot past the wizard's head, and he watched it grow smaller as it plummeted towards a circle of upturned muzzles. The circle suddenly closed. The circle suddenly expanded. The concerted yelp of a pain as the pack fought to escape the furious cloud echoed among the trees. Rincewind grinned inanely. Rincewind's elbow nudged something. It was the tree trunk. The strip had carried him right to the end of the branch. But there were no other branches. The smooth bark beside him offered no handholds. It offered hands, though. There were, even now, thrusting through the mossy bark beside him, slim hands, green as young leaves. Then a shapely arm followed, and the Hamadryad leaned right out and grasped the astonished wizard firmly, and with that vegetable strength that can send roots questing into rock, drew him into the tree. The solid bark parted like a mist, closed like a clam. Deft watched impassively. He glanced at the cloud of mayflies that were dancing their joyful zigzags near his skull. He snapped his fingers. The insects fell out of the air. But somehow, it wasn't quite the same. Blind Eel pushed his stack of chips across the table, glowered through such of his eyes that were currently in the room, and strode out. A few demigods tittered. At least Offler had taken the loss of a perfectly good troll with precise, if somewhat reptilian, grace. The lady's last opponent shifted his seat until he faced her across the board. "Lord," she said politely. "Lady," he acknowledged. Their eyes met. He was a taciturn god. It was said that he had arrived in the Discworld after some terrible and mysterious incident in another eventuality. It is, of course, the privilege of gods to control their apparent outer form, even to other gods. The fate of the Discworld was currently a kindly man in the late middle age, graying hair brushed neatly around the features, that the maiden would confidently proffer a glass of small beer to, should they appear at her back door. It was a face a kindly youth would gladly help over a style. Except for his eyes, of course. No deity can disguise the manner and nature of his eyes. The nature of the true eyes of the fate of the Discworld was this: that while at a mere glance they were simply dark, a closer look would reveal, too late, that they were buttholes opening into a blackness so remote, so deep, that the watcher would feel himself inexorably drawn into the twin pools of infinite night and their terrible wheeling stars. The lady coughed politely and laid 21 white chips on the table. Then, from her robe, she took another chip, silvery and translucent, and twice the size of the others. The soul of a true hero always finds a better rate of exchange, and is valued highly by the gods. Fate raised an eyebrow. "And no cheating, lady," he said. "But who could cheat fate?" she asked. He shrugged. "No one. Yet everyone tries. And yet again, I believe I felt you giving me a little assistance against the others. But of course, so that the end game could be the sweeter, lady. And now..." He reached into his gaming box and brought forth a piece, setting it down on the board with a satisfied air. The watching deities gave a collective sigh. Even the lady was momentarily taken aback. It was certainly ugly. The carving was uncertain, as if the craftsman's hands were shaking in horror of the thing taking shape under his reluctant fingers. It seemed to be all suckers and tentacles, and mandibles, the lady observed, and one great eye. "I saw such as he died out at the beginnings of time," she said. "Mayhap our necrotic friend was loath even to go near this one," laughed Fate. "He was enjoying himself. It should never have been spawned." "Nevertheless," said Fate gnomically, he scooped the dice into their unusual box, and then glanced up at her. "Unless," he added, "you wish to resign?" She shook her head. "Play," she said. "You can match my stake? Play." Rincewind knew what was inside trees. Wood, sap, possibly squirrels. Not a palace. Still, the cushions underneath him were definitely softer than wood. The wine in the wooden cup beside him was much tastier than sap, and there could be absolutely no comparison between a squirrel and the girl sitting before him, clasping her knees and watching him thoughtfully, unless mention was made of certain hints of furriness. The room was high, wide, and lit with a soft yellow light which came from no particular source that Rincewind could identify. Through gnarled and knotted archways he could see other rooms, and what looked like a very large winding staircase. And it had looked a perfectly normal tree from the outside, too. The girl was green. Flesh green. Rincewind could be absolutely certain about that. because all she was wearing was a medallion around her neck. Her long hair had a faintly mossy look about it. Her eyes had no pupils and were a luminous green. Rincewind wished he had paid more attention to anthropology lectures at university. She had said nothing. Apart from indicating the couch and offering him the wine, she had not done no more than sit watching him, occasionally rubbing a deep scratch on her arm. Rincewind hurriedly recalled that the dryad was so linked to her tree that she suffered wounds in sympathy. "Sorry about that," he said quickly. "It was just an accident. I mean, there were these wolves and—" "You had to climb my tree and I rescued you," said the dryad smoothly. "How lucky for you. And for your friend, perhaps?" "Friend?" "The little man with the magic box," said the dryad. "Oh, sure, him," said Rincewind vaguely. "Yeah, I hope he's okay." "He needs your help." "He usually does. Did he make it to a tree too?" "He made it to the temple of Bel-Shamharoth." Rincewind choked on his wine. His ears tried to crawl into his head in terror of the syllables they had just heard. The Soul Eater! Before he could stop them, the memories came galloping back. Once, while a student of practical magic at Unseen University, and for a bet, he'd slipped into the little room of the main library. The room with walls covered in protective lead pentagrams. The room no one was allowed to occupy for more than 4 minutes and 32 seconds, which was a figure arrived at after 200 years of cautious experimentation. He had gingerly opened the book, which was chained to the octagon pedestal in the middle of the rune-strewn floor, not lest someone steal it, but lest it escape. For it was the octavo, so full of magic that it had its own vague sentience. One spell had indeed leapt from the crackling pages and lodged itself in the dark recesses of his brain. And, apart from knowing that it was one of the vague great spells, no one would know which one until he said it. Even Rincewind did not, but he could feel it sometimes, sidling out of sight behind his ego, biding its time. On the front of the octavo had been a representation of Bel-Shamharoth. He was not evil, for even evil has a certain vitality. Bel-Shamharoth was the flip side of the coin of which good and evil are but one side. The Soul Eater. His number lieth between 7 and 9. It is twice 4, Rincewind quoted, his mind frozen with fear. Oh no! Where's the temple? Upward, toward the center of the forest, said the dryad. It is very old. But who would be so stupid as to worship Bel? Him! I mean, devils, yes, but he is the Soul Eater. There were certain advantages, and the race that used to live in these parts had strange notions. What happened to them then? I did say they used to live in these parts. The dryad stood up and stretched out her hand. Come, I am Drule. Come with me and watch your friend's fate. It should be interesting. I'm not sure that... began Rincewind. The dryad turned her green eyes on him. Do you believe you have a choice? She asked. A staircase broad as a major highway wound up through the tree, with vast rooms leading off at every landing. The sourceless yellow light was everywhere. There was also a sound like... Rincewind concentrated, trying to identify it, like far-off thunder, or a distant waterfall. It's the tree, said Dryad shortly. What's it doing? Said Rincewind. Living. I wondered about that. I mean, are we really in a tree? Have I been reduced in size? From the outside it looked narrow enough for me to put my arms around. It is. But here I am inside it. You are? Said Rincewind. Drule laughed. I can see into your mind, false wizard, and I am not a dryad. Am I not a dryad? Do you not know that what you belittle by the name tree is but a mere four-dimensional analog of a whole multidimensional universe, which... No, I can see you do not. I should have realized that you weren't a real wizard when I saw you didn't have a staff. Lost it in a fire, lied Rincewind automatically. No hat with magic sigil embroidered on it. It blew off. No familiar. It died. Look, thanks for rescuing me, but if you don't mind, I think I ought to be going. If you could show me the way out. Something in her expression made him turn around. There were 3 he-dryads behind him. They were as naked as the woman, and unarmed. That last fact was irrelevant, however. They didn't look as though they would need weapons to fight Rincewind. They looked as though they could shoulder their way through solid rock and beat up a regiment of trolls into the bargain. The 3 handsome giants looked down at him with wooden menace. Their skins were the color of walnut husks, and under it muscles bulged like sacks of melons. He turned around again and grinned weakly at Drule. Life was beginning to take on a familiar shape again. "I'm not rescued, am I?" he said. "I'm captured, right?" "Of course." "And you're not letting me go." It was a statement. Drule shook her head. "You heard the tree, but you are lucky. Your friend is going to meet Bel Shamharoth. You will only die." From behind, 2 hands gripped his shoulders, in much the same way that an old tree root coils relentlessly around a pebble. "With a certain amount of ceremony, of course," the dryad went on. "After the Sender of Fate has finished with your friend." All Rincewind could manage to say was, "You know, I never imagined there were he-dryads, not even in an oak tree." One of the giants grinned at him. Drule snorted. "Stupid! Where do you think acorns come from?" There was a vast empty space like a hall, its roof lost in the golden haze. The endless stair ran right up through it. Several hundred dryads were clustered at the other end of the hall. They parted respectfully when Drule approached, and stared through Rincewind as he was propelled firmly along behind. Most of them were females, although there were a few of the giant males among them. They stood like god-shaped statues among the small, intelligent females. Insects, thought Rincewind. The tree is like a hive. But why were there dryads at all? As far as he could recall, the tree people had died out centuries before. They had been out-evolved by humans, like most of the other Twilight peoples. Only elves and trolls had survived the coming of man to the Discworld. The elves because they were altogether too clever by half, and the trollen folk because they were at least as good as humans at being nasty, spiteful, and greedy. Dryads were supposed to have died out, along with gnomes and pixies. The background roar was louder here. Sometimes a pulsing golden glow would race up the translucent walls until it was lost in the haze overhead. Some power in the air made it vibrate. "Oh, incompetent wizard," said Drule. "See some magic. Not your weasel-faced stay magic, but root and branch magic, the old magic, wild magic. Watch." 50 or so of the females formed a tight cluster, joined hands, and walked backward until they formed the circumference of a large circle. The rest of the dryads began a low chant. Then, at a nod from Drule, the circle began to spin withershins. As the pace began to quicken, and the complicated threads of the chant began to rise, Rincewind found himself watching, fascinated. He had heard about the old magic at university, although it was forbidden to wizards. He knew that when the circle was spinning fast enough against the standing magical field of the Discworld itself in its slow turning, the resulting astral friction would build up a vast potential difference which would earth itself by a vast discharge of the elemental magic force. The circle was a blur now, and the walls of the tree rang with the echoes of the chant. Rincewind felt the familiar sticky prickling in the scalp that indicated the buildup of a heavy charge of raw enchantment in the vicinity, and so he was not utterly amazed when, a few seconds later, a shaft of vivid octarine light speared down from the invisible ceiling and focused, crackling, in the center of the circle. There it formed an image of a storm-swept, tree-girt hill with a temple on its crest. Its shape did unpleasant things to the eye. Rincewind knew that if it was a temple to Bel-Shamharoth, it would have 8 sides. 8 was also the number of Bel-Shamharoth, which was why a sensible wizard would never mention the number if he could avoid it. "Or you'll be 8 alive," apprentices were jocularly warned. Bel-Shamharoth was especially attracted to dabblers in magic who, by being, as it were, beachcombers on the shores of the unnatural, were already half enmeshed in his nets. Rincewind's room number in his hall of residence had been 7A. He hadn't been surprised. Rain streamed off the black walls of the temple. The only sign of life was the horse tethered outside, and it wasn't Two Flowers' horse. For one thing, it was too big. It was a white charger with hooves the size of meat dishes, and leather harness aglitter with ostentatious gold ornamentation. It was currently enjoying a nosebag. There was something familiar about it. Rincewind tried to remember where he had seen it before. It looked as though it was capable of a fair turn of speed, anyway. A speed which, once it had lumbered up to it, it could maintain for a long time. All Rincewind had to do was shake off his guards, fight his way out of the tree, find the temple, and steal the horse out from under whatever it was that Bel-Shamharoth had used for a nose. "The Center of Fate has chew for dinner, it seems," said Drule, looking hard at Rincewind. "Who does that steed belong to, false wizard?" "I've no idea." "No? Well, it does not matter. We shall see soon enough." She waved a hand. The focus of the image moved inward, darted through a great octagonal archway, and sped along the corridor window. There was a figure there, sidling along stealthily with its back against one wall. Rincewind saw the gleam of gold and bronze. There was no mistaking that shape. He'd seen it many times. The wide chest, the neck like a tree trunk, the surprisingly small head under its wild thack of black hair, looking like a tomato on a coffin. He could put a name to the creeping figure, and that name was Harun the Barbarian. Harun was one of the Circle C's more durable heroes. A fighter of dragons, a despoiler of temples, a hired sword, the king post of every street brawl. He could even, and unlike many heroes of Rincewind's acquaintance, speak words of more than 2 syllables, if given time and maybe a hint or 2. There was a sound on the edge of Rincewind's hearing. It sounded like several skulls bouncing down the steps of some distant dungeon. He looked sideways at his guards to see if they had heard it. They had all their limited attention focused on Harun, who was admittedly built on the same lines as themselves. Their hands were resting lightly on the wizard's shoulders. Rincewind ducked, jerked backward like a tumbler, and came up running. Behind him he heard Drule shout, and he redoubled his speed. Something caught the hood of his robe, which tore off. A he-dryad waiting at the stairs spread his arms wide and grinned woodenly at the figure hurtling toward him. Without breaking his stride, Rincewind ducked again, so low that his chin was on a level with his knees, while a fist like a log size sizzled through the air by his ear. Ahead of him, a whole spinney of the 3 men awaited. He spun around, dodged another blow from the puzzled guard, and sped back toward the circle, passing on the way the dryads who were pursuing him, and leaving them as disorganized as a set of skittles. But there were still more in front, pushing their way through the crowds of females, and smacking their fists into the horny palms of their hands with anticipatory concentration. "Stand still, false wizard," said Drule, stepping forward. Behind her, the enchanted dancers spun on. The focus of the circle was now drifting along a violet-lit corridor. Rincewind cracked. "Will you knock that off?" he snarled. "Let's just get this straight, right? I am a real wizard." He stamped a foot petulantly. "Indeed," said the dryad. "Then let us see you pass a spell." Began Rincewind. The fact was that, since the ancient and mysterious spell had squatted in his mind, he had been unable to remember even the simplest cantrap for, say, killing cockroaches or scratching the small of his back without using his hands. The mages at Unseen University had tried to explain this by suggesting that the involuntary memorizing of the spell had, as it were, tied up all his spell retention cells. In his darker moments, Rincewind had come up with his own explanation as to why even minor spells refused to stay in his head for more than a few seconds. They were scared, he decided. He repeated. A small one would do, said Drule, watching him curl his lips in a frenzy of anger and embarrassment. She signaled, and a couple of he-dryads closed in. The spell chose that moment to vault into the temporarily abandoned saddle of Rincewind's consciousness. He felt it sitting there, leering defiantly at him. I do know a spell, he said wearily. Yes, pray tell, said Drule. Rincewind wasn't sure that he dared. Although the spell was trying to take control of his tongue, he fought it. You said you could read my mind, said indistinctly. He said, read it. She stepped forward, looking mockingly into his eyes. Her smile froze. Her hands raised protectively. She crouched back. From her throat came a sound of pure terror. Rincewind looked around. The rest of the dryads were also backing away. What had he done? Something terrible, apparently. But in his experience, it was only a matter of time before the normal balance of the universe restored itself and started doing the usual terrible things to him. He backed away, ducked between the still spinning dryads who were creating the magic circle, and watched to see what Drule would do next. Grab him, she screamed. Take him a long way from the tree and kill him. Rincewind turned and bolted. Across the focus of the circle, there was a brilliant flash. There was a sudden darkness. There was a vaguely Rincewind-shaped violet shadow dwindling to a point and winking out. There was nothing at all. Hurun the barbarian crept so soundlessly along the corridors, which were lit with a light so violet that it was almost black. His earlier confusion was gone. This was obviously a magical temple, and that explained everything. It explained why, earlier in the afternoon, he had SP'd a chest by the side of the track while riding through this benighted forest. Its top was invitingly open, displaying much gold. When he had leapt off his horse to approach it, the chest had sprouted legs and had gone trotting off into the forest, stopping again a few hundred yards away. Now, after several hours of teasing pursuit, he had lost it in these hell-lit tunnels. On the whole, the unpleasant carvings and occasional disjointed skeletons he passed held no fears for Hurun. This was partly because he was not exceptionally bright, while being at the same time exceptionally unimaginative, but it was also because odd carvings and perilous tunnels were all in the day's work. He spent a great deal of time in similar situations, seeking gold, or demons, or distressed virgins, and relieving them respectively of their owners, their lives, and at least one cause of their distress. Observe, Hurun, as he leaps cat-footed across a suspicious tunnel mouth. Even in this violet light, his skin gleams coppery. There is much gold about his person, in the form of anklets and wristlets, but otherwise he's naked, except for a leopard skin loincloth. He took that in the steaming forests of Hawondaland, after killing its owner with his teeth. In his right hand, he carries the magical black sword Kring, which was forged from a thunderbolt and has a soul but suffers no scabbard. Hurun had stolen it only 3 days before from the impregnable palace of the Archmandrite of Bituni, and he was already regretting it. It was beginning to get on his nerves. I tell you it went down that last passage on the right, hissed Kring in a voice like the scrape of a blade over stone. Be silent. All I said was, shut up. And True Flower. He was lost. He knew that. Either the building was much bigger than it looked, or he was now on some wide underground level without having gone down any steps. Or, as he was beginning to suspect, the inner dimensions of the place disobeyed a fairly basic rule of architecture by being bigger than the outside. And why all these strange lights? They were 8-sided crystals set at irregular intervals in the walls and ceiling, and they shed a rather unpleasant glow that didn't so much illuminate as outline the darkness. And whoever had done those carvings on the wall, Twoflower thought charitably, had probably been drinking too much. For years. On the other hand, it was certainly a fascinating building. Its builders had been obsessed with the number 8. The floor was a continuous mosaic of 8-sided tiles. The corridor walls were angled to give the corridors 8 sides if the walls and ceilings were counted, and in those places where part of the masonry had fallen in, Twoflower noticed that even the stones themselves had 8 sides. "I don't like it," said the picture imp from his box around Twoflower's neck. "Why not?" inquired Twoflower. "It's weird." "But you're a demon. Demons can't call things weird. I mean, what's weird to a demon?" "Oh, you know," said the demon cautiously, glancing around nervously and shifting from claw to claw. "Things. Stuff." Twoflower looked at him sternly. "What things?" The demon coughed nervously. Demons do not breathe. However, every intelligent being, whether it breathes or not, coughs nervously at some time in its life. And this was one of them as far as the demon was concerned. "Oh, things," it said wretchedly. "Evil things. Things we don't talk about is the point I'm broadly trying to get across, master." Twoflower shook his head wearily. "I think Rincewind was here," he said. "I wish Rincewind was here," he said. "He'd know what to do." "Him?" sneered the demon. "Can't see a wizard coming here. They can't have anything to do with the number 8. The demon slapped a hand across his mouth guiltily. Twoflower looked up at the ceiling. "What was that?" he asked. "Didn't you hear something?" "Me? Hear? No, not a thing," the demon insisted. It jerked back into its box and slammed the door. Twoflower tapped on it. The door opened a crack. "It sounded like a stone moving," he explained. The door banged shut. Twoflower shrugged. "The place is probably falling to bits," he said to himself. He stood up. "I say," he shouted, "is anyone there?" "Air, air, air," replied the tunnels. "Hello?" he tried. "Low, low, low." "I know there's someone there. I just heard you playing dice." "Ice, ice, ice. Look, I had just..." Twoflower stopped. The reason for this was the bright point of light that had popped into existence a few feet from his eyes. It grew rapidly, and after a few seconds was a tiny bright shape of a man. At this stage it began to make a noise, or rather, Twoflower started to hear the noise it had been making all along. It sounded like a sliver of a scream, cut in one long instant of time. The iridescent man was doll-sized now, a tortured shape tumbling in slow motion while hanging in midair. Twoflower wondered why he had thought of the phrase, "a sliver of a scream," and began to wish he hadn't. It was beginning to look like Rincewind. The wizard's mouth was open, and his face was brilliantly lit by the light of... What? Strange suns, Twoflower found himself thinking. Suns men don't usually see. He shivered. Now the turning wizard was half man-sized. At that point the growth was faster. There was a sudden crowded moment, a rush of air, and an explosion of sound. Rincewind tumbled out of the air, screaming. He hit the floor hard, choked, then rolled over with his head cradled in his arms and his body curled up tightly. When the dust had settled, Twoflower reached out gingerly and tapped the wizard on the shoulder. The human ball rolled up tighter. "It's me," explained Twoflower helpfully. The wizard unrolled the fraction. "What?" He said, "Me!" In one movement, Rincewind unrolled and bounced up in front of the little man, his hands gripping his shoulders desperately. His eyes were wild and wide. "Don't say it," he said. "Don't say it and we might get out." "Get out? How did you get in? Don't you know—" "Don't say it!" Chewflower backed away from this madman. "Don't say it!" "Don't say what?" "The number." "Number?" said Chewflower. "Hey, Rincewind." "Yes, number." "Between 7 and 9. 4 plus 4. "What? 8? Rincewind's hands clapped over the man's mouth. "Say it and we're doomed. Just don't think about it, right? Trust me." "I don't understand," wailed Chewflower. Rincewind relaxed slightly, which was to say that he still made a violin string look like a ball of jelly. "Come on," he said. "Let's try and get out, and I'll try and tell ya." Right, we got ads coming up, so I will take a short break, okay, and I'll be right back in just a few minutes. Yeah. I return to the book reading. Hello. I like how this book is pretty old, but I like how it reads like a Dungeons and Dragons campaign kind of. It's just goofy fun, isn't it? Just a bunch of incompetent dudes trying to go on an adventure of some sort. You know, yeah. I did read like reviews saying how this isn't the best Discworld to start with because like it's like the conventions of fantasy that is parodying are like old or something. It might not be understandable, but I don't suppose I've seen anything of that so far. Like, it seems perfectly fine to me, you know? Nothing particularly obscure or unknown yet. But then maybe I'm just more familiar with fantasy, so that's why. This is a very fun book. It's very cartoonish in ways, isn't it? It's great. Anyway, let us turn down the music a little bit. It's a bit loud. And continue the reading, I think. Let's see what's going on in this horrible nightmare temple. Also, let me slurp my coffee real fast. After the first stage of magic, the disposal of grimoires began to become a severe problem under this world. A spell is still a spell even when imprisoned temporarily in parchment and ink. It has potency. This is not a problem while the book's owner still lives, but on his death, the spellbook becomes a source of uncontrolled power that cannot be easily diffused. In short, spellbooks leak magic. Various solutions have been tried. Countries near the rim simply loaded down the books of dead mages with leaden pentalphas and threw them over the edge. Near the hub, less satisfactory alternatives were available. Inserting the offending books in canisters of negatively polarized octeron and sinking them in the fathomless depths of the sea was one. Burial in deep caves on land was earlier ruled out after some districts complained of walking trees and five-headed cats. But before long, the magic seeped out, and eventually fishermen complained of shoals of invisible fish or psychic clams. A temporary solution was the construction, in various centers of magical lore, of large rooms made of denatured octeron, which is impervious to most forms of magic. Here, the more critical grimoires could be stored until their potency had attenuated. That was how there came to be at Unseen University the Octavo, greatest of all grimoires, formerly owned by the creator of the universe. It was this book that Rincewind had once opened for a bet. He had only a second to stare at a page before setting off Fairy's alarm spells, but that was time enough for one spell to leap from it and settle in his memory like a toad in a stone. "Then what?" said Chewflower. "Oh, they dragged me out. Thrashed me, of course." "And no one knows what the spell does?" Rincewind shook his head. "It had vanished from the page," he said. "No one will know until I say it. Or until I die, of course. Then it will sort of say itself. For all I know, it stops the universe. Or ends time. Or anything." Chewflower patted him on the shoulder. "No sense in brooding," he said cheerfully. "Let's have another look for a way out." Rincewind shook his head. All the terror had been spent now. He had broken through the terror barrier, perhaps, and was in the dead calm state of mind that lies on the other side. Anyway, he had ceased to gibber. "We're doomed," he stated. "We've been walking around all night. I tell ya, this place is a spider web. It doesn't matter which way we go, we'll end up in the center." "It was kind of you to come looking for me anyway," said Chewflower. "How did you manage it exactly? It was very impressive." "Oh well," began the wizard awkwardly. "I just thought I can't leave old Chewflower there and... So, what we've got to do now is find this Belshamharath person and explain things to him, and perhaps he'll let us out," said Chewflower. Rincewind ran a finger around his ear. "It must be the funny echoes in here," he said. "I thought I heard you use words like find and explain." "That's right." Rincewind glared at him in the hellish purple glow. "Find Belshamharath," he said. "Yes. We don't have to get involved." "Find the Soul Render and not get involved. Just give him a nod, I suppose, and ask the way to the exit. Explain things to the sender of Rincewind bit off the end of the word just in time and finished. "You're insane! Hey, come back!" He darted down the passage after Chewflower, and after a few moments came to a halt with a groan. The violet light was intense here, giving everything new and unpleasant colors. This wasn't a passage. It was a wide room with walls to a number that Rincewind didn't dare to contemplate. And 7A passages radiating from it. Rincewind saw, a little way off, a low altar with the same number of sides as 4 times 2. It didn't occupy the center of the room, however. The center was occupied by a huge stone slab with twice as many sides as a square. It looked massive. In the strange light, it appeared to be slightly tilted, with one edge standing proud of the slabs around it. Chewflower was standing on it. "Hey, Rincewind! Look what's here!" The luggage came ambling down one of the other passages that radiated from the room. "That's great," said Rincewind. "Fine, can lead us out of here. Now." Chewflower was already rummaging in the chest. "Yes," he said, "after I've taken a few pictures, just let me fit the attachment." "I said now." Rincewind stopped. Hrun the Barbarian was standing in the passage mouth directly opposite him, a great black sword held in one ham-sized fist. "You?" said Hrun uncertainly. "Aha, yes," said Rincewind. "Hrun, isn't it? Long time no see. What brings you here?" Hrun pointed to the luggage. "That," he said. This much conversation seemed to exhaust Hrun. Then he added, in a tone that combined statement, claim, and threat and ultimatum, "Mine." "It belongs to Chewflower here," said Rincewind. "Here's a tip. Don't touch it." It dawned on him that this was precisely the wrong thing to say, but Hrun had already pushed Chewflower away and was reaching for the luggage, which sprouted legs, backed away, and raised its lid, threateningly. In the uncertain light, Rincewind thought he could see rows of enormous teeth, white as bleached beechwood. Hrun, he said quickly, there's something I ought to tell you. Hrun turned a puzzled face to him. What? He said. It's about numbers. Look, you know, if you add 7 and 1, or 3 and 5, or take 2 from 10, you get a number. While you're here, don't say it, and we might all stand a chance of getting out of here alive. Or merely just dead. Who is he? Asked Chewflower. He was holding a cage in his hands, dredged from the bottommost depths of the luggage. It appeared to be full of sulking pink lizards. I am Hrun, said Hrun proudly. Then he looked at Rincewind. What? He said. Just don't say it, okay? Said Rincewind. He looked at the sword in Hrun's hand. It was black, the sort of black that is less a color than a graveyard of colors. And there was a highly ornate runic inscription up the blade. More noticeable still was the faint octarine glow that surrounded it. The sword must have noticed him too, because it suddenly spoke in a voice like a claw being scraped across glass. Strange, it said. Why can't he say 8? 8. 8. 8, said the echoes. There was the faintest of grinding noises, deep under the earth. And the echoes, although they became softer, refused to die away. They bounced from wall to wall, crossing and recrossing, and the violet light flickered in time with the sound. You did it, screamed Rincewind. I said you shouldn't say 8! He stopped, appalled at himself. But the word was out now, and joined its colleagues in the general susurration. Rincewind turned to run, but the air suddenly seemed to be thicker than treacle. A charge of magic bigger than he had ever seen was building up. Then he moved, in painful slow motion. His limbs left trails of golden sparks that traced their shape in the air. Behind him there was a rumble as the great octagonal slab rose into the air, hung from a moment on one edge, and crashed down on the floor. Something thin and black sneaked out of the pit and wrapped itself around his ankle. He screamed as he landed heavily on the vibrating flagstones. The tentacles started to pull him across the floor. Then Chewflower was in front of him, reaching out for his hands. He grasped the little man's arms desperately, and they lay looking into each other's faces. Rincewind slid on. Even so. What's holding you? He gasped. Nothing, said Chewflower. What's happening? I'm being dragged into this pit. What do you think? Oh, Rincewind, I'm sorry. You're sorry? There was a noise like a singing saw, and the pressure on Rincewind's legs abruptly ceased. He turned his head and saw Hrun crashed by the pit, his sword a blur as it hacked at the tentacles racing out toward him. Chewflower helped the wizard to his feet, and he crashed by the altar stone, watching the manic figure as it battled the questing arms. It won't work, said Rincewind. The sender can materialize tentacles. What are you doing? Chewflower was furiously attaching the cage of subdued lizards to the picture box, which he had mounted on a tripod. I've just got to get a picture of this, he muttered. It's stupendous. Can you hear me, Imp? The picture imp opened his tiny hatch, glanced momentarily at the scene around the pit, and vanished into the box. Rincewind jumped as something touched his leg, and brought his heel down on a questing tentacle. Come on, he said. Time to go zoom. He grabbed Chewflower's arm, but the tourist resisted. Run away and leave Hrun with that thing? He said. Rincewind looked blank. Why not? He said. It's his job. But it'll kill him. It could be worse, said Rincewind. What? It could be us, Rincewind pointed out logically. Come on. Chewflower pointed. Hey, he said. It's got my luggage. Before Rincewind could restrain him, Chewflower ran around the edge of the pit to the box, which was being dragged across the floor while its lid snapped ineffectually at the tentacle that held it. The little man began to kick at the tentacle in fury. Another one snapped out of the melee around Hrun and caught him around the waist. Hrun himself was already an indistinct shape amid the tightening coils. Even as Rincewind stared in horror, the hero's sword was wrenched from his grasp and hurled against a wall. "Your spell!" shouted Chewflower. Rincewind did not move. He was looking at the thing rising out of the pit. It was an enormous eye, and it was staring directly at him. He whimpered as a tentacle fastened itself around his waist. The words of the spell rose unbidden in his throat. He opened his mouth as in a dream, shaping it around the first barbaric syllable. Another tentacle shot out like a whip and coiled around his throat, choking him. Staggering and gasping, Rincewind was dragged across the floor. One flailing arm caught Chewflower's picture box as it skittered past on its tripod. He snatched it up instinctively, as its ancestors might have snatched up a stone when faced with a marauding tiger. If only he could get enough room to swing it against the eye. The eye filled the whole universe in front of him. Rincewind felt his will draining away like water from a sieve. In front of him, the torpid lizards stirred in their cage on the picture box. Irrationally, as a man about to be beheaded notices every scratch and stain on the executioner's block, Rincewind saw that they had overlarge tails that were bluish-white, and he realized, throbbing alarmingly. As he was drawn toward the eye, the terror-struck Rincewind raised the box protectively, and at the same time heard the picture imp say, "They're about ripe now. Can't hold them any longer. Everyone smile, please." There was a flash of light, so white and so bright. It didn't seem like light at all. Bel Shamharoff screamed, a sound that started in the far ultrasonic and finished somewhere in Rincewind's bowels. The tentacles were momentarily as stiff as rods, hurling their various cargoes around the room before bunching up protectively in front of the abused eye. The whole mass dropped into the pit, and a moment later the big slab was snatched up by several dozen tentacles and slammed into place, leaving a number of thrashing limbs trapped around the edge. Huron landed rolling, bounced off a wall, and came up on his feet. He found his sword and started to chop methodically at the doomed arms. Rincewind lay on the floor, concentrating on not going mad. A hollow wooden noise made him turn his head. The luggage had landed on its curved lid. Now it was rocking angrily and kicking its little legs in the air. Warily, Rincewind looked around for Chewflower. The little man was in a crumpled heap against the wall, but at least he was groaning. The wizard pulled himself across the floor painfully and whispered, "What the hell was that?" "Why were they so bright?" muttered Chewflower. "Gods, my head!" "Too bright," said Rincewind. He looked across the floor to the cage of the picture box. The lizards inside, now noticeably thinner, were watching him with interest. "The salamanders," moaned Chewflower. "The picture will be overexposed, I know it." "They're salamanders?" asked Rincewind incredulously. "Of course. Standard attachment." Rincewind staggered across to the box and picked it up. He'd seen salamanders before, of course, but they had been small specimens. They had also been floating in a jar of pickle in the Curio Biological Museum down in the cellars of Unseen University, since live salamanders were extinct around the Circle C. He tried to remember the little he knew about them. They were magical creatures. They also had no mouths, since they subsisted entirely on the nourishing quality of the octarine wavelength in the Discworld sunlight, which they absorbed through their skins. Of course, they also absorbed the rest of the sunlight as well, storing it in a special sac until it was excreted in the normal way. A desert inhabited by Discworld salamanders was a veritable lighthouse at night. Rincewind put them down and nodded grimly. With all the octarine light in this magical place, the creatures had been gorging themselves, and then nature had taken its course. The picture box sidled away on its tripod. Rincewind aimed a kick at it, and missed. He was beginning to dislike sapient Peerwood. Something small stung his cheek. He brushed it away irritably. He looked around at the sudden grinding noise, and a voice like a carving knife, cutting through silk, said, "This is very undignified." "Shut up," said Hurun. He was using Kring to lever the top of the altar. He looked up at Rincewind and grinned. Rincewind hoped that Rictus' strong grimace was a grin. "Mighty magic," commented the barbarian, pushing down heavily on the complaining blade with a hand the size of a ham. "Now we share the treasure, eh?" Rincewind grunted as something small and hard struck his ear. There was a gust of wind, hardly felt. "How do you know there's treasure in there?" he said. Hurun heaved and managed to hook his fingers under the stone. "You find choke apples under a choke apple tree," he said. "You find treasure under altars. Logic." He gritted his teeth. The stone swung up and landed heavily on the floor. This time something struck Rincewind's hand, heavily. He clawed at the air and looked at the thing he had caught. It was a piece of stone with 5 plus 3 sides. He looked up at the ceiling. Should it be sagging like that? Hurun hummed a little tune as he began to pull crumbling leather from the desecrated altar. The air crackled, fluoresced, hummed. Intangible winds gripped the wizard's robe, flapping it out in eddies of blue and green sparks. Around Rincewind's head, mad, half-formed spirits howled and gibbered as they were sucked past. He tried raising a hand. It was immediately surrounded by a glowing octarine corona, as the rising magical wind roared past. The gale raced through the room without stirring one iota of dust, yet it was blowing Rincewind's eyelids inside out. It screamed along the tunnels, its banshee wail bouncing madly from stone to stone. Chewflower staggered up, bent double in the teeth of the astral gale. "What the hell is this?" he shouted. Rincewind half-turned. Immediately the howling wind caught him, nearly pitching him over. Poltergeist eddies, spinning in the rushing air, snatched at his feet. Hurun's arm shot out and caught him. A moment later he and Chewflower had been dragged into the lee of the ravaged altar and lay panting on the floor. Beside them the talking sword Kring sparkled, its magical field boosted 100-fold by the storm. "Hold on!" screamed Rincewind. "The wind!" shouted Chewflower. "Where is it coming from? Where is it blowing to?" He looked into Rincewind's mask of sheer terror, which made him redouble his own grip on the stones. "We're doomed," murmured Rincewind. While overhead the roof cracked and shifted. "Where do shadows come from? That's where the wind is blowing." What was in fact happening, as the wizard knew, was that as the abused spirit of Bel-Shamharoth sank through the deeper chthonic planes, his brooding spirit was being sucked out of the very stones into the region which, according to the Discworld's most reliable priests, was both under the ground and somewhere else. In consequence, his temple was being abandoned to the ravages of time, who, for thousands of shamefaced years, had been reluctant to go near the place. Now, the suddenly released, accumulated weight of all those pent-up seconds was bearing down heavily on the unbraced stones. Hurun glanced up at the widening cracks and sighed. Then he put 2 fingers into his mouth and whistled. Strangely, the real sound rang out loudly over the pseudo-sound of the widening astral whirlpool that was forming in the middle of the great octagonal slab. It was followed by the hollow echo which sounded, he fancied, strangely like the bouncing of strange bones. Then came a noise with no hint of strangeness. It was hollow hoofbeats. Hurun's warhorse cantered through a creaking archway and reared up by its master, its mane streaming in the gale. The barbarian pulled himself to his feet and slung his treasure bags into a sack that hung from the saddle, then hauled himself onto the beast's back. He reached down and grabbed Jewflower by the scruff of his neck, dragging him across the saddle tree. As the horse turned around, Rincewind took a desperate leap and landed behind Rune, who raised no objection. The horse pounded sure-footed along the tunnels, leaping sudden slides of rubble and adroitly sidestepping huge stones as he thundered down from the straining roof. Rincewind, clinging on grimly, looked behind them. No wonder the horse was moving so swiftly. Close behind, speeding through the flickering violet light, were a large, ominous-looking chest and a picture box that skittered along dangerously on its 3 legs. So great was the ability of sapient Peerwood to follow its master anywhere that grave goods of dead emperors had traditionally been made of it. They reached the outer air a moment before the octagonal arch finally broke and smashed into the flags. The sun was rising. Behind them, a column of dust rose as the temple collapsed in on itself, but they did not look back. That was a shame, because Jewflower might have been able to obtain pictures unusual even by Discworld standards. There was a movement in the smoking ruins. They seemed to be growing a green carpet. Then an oak tree spiraled up, branching out like an exploding green rocket, and was in the middle of a venerable copse even before the tips of its aged branches had stopped quivering. A beech burst out like a fungus, matured, rotted, and fell in a cloud of tinder dust amid its struggling offspring. Already the temple was a half-buried heap of mossy stones. But time, having initially gone for the throat, was now setting out to complete the job. The boiling interface between decaying magic and ascendant entropy roared down the hill and overtook the galloping horse, whose riders, being themselves creatures of time, completely failed to notice it. But it lashed into the enchanted forest with the whip of centuries. "Impressive, isn't it?" observed a voice by Rincewind's knee as the horse cantered through the haze of decaying timber and falling leaves. The voice had an eerie metallic ring to it. Rincewind looked down at Kring the sword. It had a couple of rubies set in the pommel. He got the impression they were watching him. From the moorland rimward of the wood, they watched the battle between the trees and time, which could only have one ending. It was a sort of cabaret to the main business of the halt, which was the consumption of quite a lot of bear, which had incautiously come within the bowshot of Hrun. Rincewind watched Hrun over the top of his slab of greasy meat. Hrun, going about the business of being a hero, he realized was quite different from the wine-bibbing, carousing Hrun who occasionally came to Ankh-Morpork. He was cat-cautious, lithe as a panther, and thoroughly at home. "And I've survived Belsham Harath," Rincewind reminded himself. "Fantastic." I'll take a short break real fast. "Hi, Minnie. Hello, how you doing?" "Hello." Well, that was, staggering. Very staggering. Well, that was a chaotic event, huh? I suppose you caught this whole thing, Minnie, in the middle of the action, so it's a bit confusing of what's happening. Speep? Yeah, Speep. You know, I feel like if I were in a dungeon crawl in a D&D campaign, this is exactly how it would go. Just completely accidental utter chaos. And unearthing ancient evils that you didn't have to unearth. But yeah, and I specifically mentioned Dungeons and Dragons here because many of you missed it, but the gods are actually literally playing dice with the characters right now. It's a whole thing from earlier. You might wanna read watch the start of the stream later so to catch up if you feel so inclined. Because it's a quite fun bit to look at. Yes. You are. You are. And just leave it on in the background, you know, as you do your other business. Check out the doggy. Anyway, let me get a little drink of water and I'll continue. Right now we're 45% of the way through the book. I think I'll just continue with the same pace I have been doing of reading one of these big chapters a stream. And that should give me about 4 streams of this book. Until I move on to the next one. Because one is about long enough. Some are longer, some are shorter. But two's too long to keep reading, I think. I can already feel my throat drying out too much even if I drink water, so yeah. Okay, so let us continue. Flower was helping the hero sort through the treasure stolen from the temple. It was mostly silver set with unpleasant purple stones. Representations of spiders, octopi, and the tree-dwelling octoroseer of the Hudland Wastes figured largely in the heap. Rincewind tried to shut his ears to the grating voice beside him. It was no use. And then I belonged to the Pasha the Ridurat and played a prominent part in the Ballad of Great Neff, which is why I received a slight nick you may have noticed some 2/3 of the way up my blade. Kring was saying from its temporary home in a tussock. Some infidel was wearing an octagon collar, most unsporting, and of course, I was a lot sharper in those days, and my master used to use me to cut silk handkerchiefs in midair, and am I bothering you? Huh? Oh, no, not at all. It's all very interesting, said Rincewind with his eyes still on Hrun. How trustworthy would he be? Here they were, out in the wilds. There were trolls about. I could see you were a cultured person, Kring went on. So seldom do I get to meet really interesting people, for any length of time, anyway. What I'd really like is a nice mantelpiece to hang over, somewhere nice and quiet. I spent a couple of 100 years on the bottom of a lake once. That must have been fun, said Rincewind absently. Not really, said Kring. No, I suppose not. What I'd really like is to be a plowshare. I don't know what that is, but it sounds like an existence with some point to it. Trueflower hurried over to the wizard. I had a great idea, he burbled. Yeah, said Rincewind warily. Why don't we get Hrun to accompany us to Quirm? Trueflower looked amazed. How did you know? He said. I just thought you'd think it, said Rincewind. Hrun ceased stuffing silverware into his saddlebags and grinned encouragingly at them. Then his eyes strayed back to the luggage. If we had him with us, who'd attack us? Said Trueflower. Rincewind scratched his chin. Hrun, you suggested? But we saved his life in the temple. Well, if by attack you mean kill, said Rincewind, I don't think he'd do that. He's not that sort. He'd just rob us and tie us up and leave us for the wolves, I expect. Oh, come on. Look, this is real life, snapped Rincewind. I mean, here you are, carrying around a box full of gold. Don't you think anyone in their right minds would jump at the chance of pinching it? I would, he added mentally, if I hadn't seen what the luggage does to prying fingers. Then the answer hit him. He looked from Hrun to the picture box. The picture imp was doing its laundry in a tiny tub, while the salamanders dozed in their cage. I've got an idea, he said. I mean, what is it heroes really want? Gold? Said Chewflower. No, I mean, really want. Chewflower frowned. I don't quite understand, he said. Rincewind picked up the picture box. Hrun, he said. Come over here, will you? The days passed peacefully. True, a small band of bridge trolls tried to ambush them on one occasion, and a party of brigands nearly caught them unawares one night, but unwisely tried to investigate the luggage before slaughtering the sleepers. Hrun demanded and got double pay for both occasions. If any harm comes to us, said Rincewind, then there will be no one to operate the magic box. No more pictures of Hrun, you understand? Hrun nodded, his eyes fixed on the latest picture. It showed Hrun striking a heroic pose, with one foot on a heap of slain trolls. Me and you and little friend Chewflowers, we all get on okay, he said. Also tomorrow, may we get a better profile, okay? He carefully racked the picture in troll skin and stowed it in his saddlebag, along with the others. It seems to be working, said Chewflower admiringly. As Hrun rode ahead to scout the road. Sure, said Rincewind. What heroes like best is themselves. You're getting quite good at using the picture box, you know that? Yar. So you might like to have this. Chewflower held out a picture. What is it? Asked Rincewind. Oh, just the picture you took in the temple. Rincewind looked in horror. There, bordered by a few glimpses of tentacle, was a huge, whorled, calloused, potion-stained, and unfocused thumb. That's the story of my life, he said wearily. You win, said Fate, pushing the heap of souls across the gaming table. The assembled gods relaxed. There will be other games, he added. The lady smiled into two eyes that were like holes in the universe. And then there was nothing but the ruin of the forests and a cloud of dust on the horizon, which drifted away on the breeze. And sitting on a pitted and moss-grown milestone, a black and raggedy figure. His was the air of one who is unjustly put upon, who is dreaded and feared, yet who is the only friend of the poor and the best doctor for the mortally wounded. Death, although of course completely eyeless, watched Rincewind disappearing with what would, had his face possessed any mobility at all, have been a frown. Death, although exceptionally busy at all times, decided that he now had a hobby. There was something about the wizard that had irked him beyond measure. He didn't keep appointments, for one thing. I'll get you yet, Cully, said Death, in the voice like the slamming of leaden coffin lids. See if I don't. Well, there you go. That's the end of that chapter. I didn't expect it to end so fast. Well, it's quite short, but I don't think I'll torture myself any longer today. For my throat, it is tired of the readings, you know. I quite like this book. It's like a fun adventure, you know. It's an adventure. In my throat. And I feel like there's not enough adventures these days, you know. Like in movies and stuff that they make, which is most of my media along with video games, they don't do adventures all that much. Maybe that's why I like my video games, because they got adventures. Makes sense to me. And it's got this goofy humor that I'm very fond of. It is very good. What do I do now, though? I'll come back with like the book the next time around, clearly, but what What do I do until then? Cause this is only an hour and a half into the stream or so, so I still have time. Yeah. Let me stop recording for now, and then let's switch to just chatting, and I'll think of something.